Hello, today we're going to discuss a utility financing mechanism called securitization. With securitization, North Carolina, like other states, can save residential, business, and government customers hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 30 years. I'm Ron Binz. I'm the former chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission.
I'm Harriet Moyer Aptekar, a national consultant on securitization, an exciting way to save ratepayers money by using cheap debt to replace expensive utility equity in power plants. I know the words securitization, debt, equity sound wonky, but Ron and I are going to make this easy.
What is securitization? It's the use of bonds to capture today the value of a stream of future benefits. You're borrowing from a future stream of payments that you know will be there. Now, you're actually familiar with this in a completely different context. Suppose you win the lottery. It pays you $1 million every year for 50 years. You don't have to wait around 50 years to see that money. Instead, you can securitize that stream of 50 payments and get a large lump sum up front. That's called the present value of the stream of future benefits. In the utility world, securitization uses corporate bonds with 4 characteristics. They are highly rated, AAA or AA, and for that reason they carry low interest rates. They have a 10 to 30-year life, and they are repaid by ratepayers. Traditional uses for securitization include those states which moved to wholesale competition in the electric markets during the 1990s. Securitization was used to reduce the cost of above-market power purchase agreements. It's been used to create reductions in rates for customers. It's been used to finance the cost of new pollution control devices. In North Carolina and other states, securitization can be used to pay for storm recovery costs. And in Florida, it was used to recover the substantial costs of an abandoned nuclear power plant. In addition to the traditional uses for securitization, there are a couple new uses. First, securitization can be used to refinance utility capital investment in fossil or nuclear plants that are no longer economic and must be retired early. Second, securitization can be used to provide funds for transition assistance to communities and workers that are negatively affected by power plant closures. Of course, North Carolina is missing out on the benefits of these new uses for securitization. Last year's legislation authorized the use of securitization, but only for costs related to storm damage. Unless the statute is revised, North Carolina will not be able to apply securitization to power plants that are retired early and thus will not be able to capture the extra consumer benefits. Thus, securitization can be seen as part of a new approach to power plant retirement. If a plant closes, utilities may still have capital invested and ratepayers may be responsible for paying that back, even though the plant is no longer running. Ratepayer-backed bonds can be used to refinance these stranded costs at lower rates. Because the bonds have a low interest rate, customers can save money and the utility can move a stranded asset off its books. The innovation is that the savings from securitization can be large, and a part of those can be used to assist communities and workers displaced by power plant closures.
Why use securitization? The simple answer is to save ratepayers money. As Ron highlighted on the last slide, replacing high-cost utility capital with low-cost ratepayer-backed bonds saves ratepayers money. This is the reason securitization has already been used in 21 states across the country. Let's take a look at how securitization has been used. This financing tool was first created in the 90s when many states deregulated their utility markets. It has continued to be used since that time to minimize customer costs. Most recently, it was used to refinance $1.3 billion in Duke Energy capital remaining in a damaged nuclear power plant. Replacing the utility capital with low-cost ratepayer-backed bonds is saving Florida ratepayers $680 million over 20 years. Here we see the states that have used securitization in the past and the three that have used it most recently. So let's take a look at the securitization process. Initially, a motivated stakeholder suggests having securitization available would be a good idea. In North Carolina, this happened in 2019, but the only use authorized was for storm cost recovery. It's now possible for North Carolina utilities to apply to the Public Utility Commission for financing, get an order to issue the bonds to cover the expenses related to storm cost recovery. Once the bonds are issued, the special purpose entity of the utility receives repayment charges collected on ratepayer bills and repays the bonds. This 20-year-old financing tool has attracted new interest as utilities across the country are deciding old fossil plants are no longer competitive when compared with cheaper renewable energy generation.
To see why securitization is growing in popularity, let's take a look at the costs of power plants in a couple states. We start with the Colorado plants owned by Xcel Energy. This chart shows the cost of each of Xcel's power plants in Colorado. The black part of the column represents capital costs, and the blue part represents fuel and operating and maintenance costs. You can see the left-hand scale is the cost of electricity in dollars per megawatt hour. Now, what's really interesting is that in Colorado, the cost of new wind generation is about $17 per megawatt hour. That means that the cost of wind is cheaper than the running costs. Forget the capital costs, cheaper than the running costs of all of those power plants. A similar story is true in North Carolina. This chart shows the costs of Duke Progress North Carolina plants, capital costs and operating costs. Capital costs is black, the running costs is the blue color. And you can see the costs of wind PPAs and solar PPAs in the state. In many cases, the cost of wind or solar is cheaper than the cost of running the fossil fuel plant. What happens to consumer rates when a utility closes a coal plant and replaces it with solar power? We start with the status quo. Here's the cost of a typical coal plant, $184 million a year, which is comprised of $79 million in costs for capital and $105 million for fuel and operating costs. Let's look what happens when the utility replaces the coal plant with solar. The fuel and operating and maintenance costs of the coal plant go away because the coal plant is shut down. Those costs are replaced by, in part, the cost of new solar. The capital costs and the operating costs of the solar are shown in green and gray at the bottom. Now, the capital costs of the coal plant are still around, and we might even expect the utility to try and speed up recovery of those assets. In any event, $143 million is the new total compared to $184 million, a good bit cheaper. I should mention that the utility could buy solar power through a PPA from another supplier. We're showing that in blue, and since each case is possible, we'll split up the solar into either owned solar or bought solar. Our analysis doesn't have to stop there. What if the utility used securitization to recover those stranded capital costs left over from the coal plant? In that case, the $91 million a year in recovery of capital costs would be securitized and turned into a bond whose payments would be about $38 million a year. The new total cost is $90 million, less than half of the $184 million of the original coal plant in operation. I want to mention this is the first year impact on rates. In the long run, consumer rates are shown by the levelized cost in cents per kilowatt hour of each approach. The original coal plant cost about 9 cents a kilowatt hour to operate. At the other end of the spectrum, securitization of that debt plus solar results in a price levelized of about 4.8 cents per kilowatt hour. Again, only about half of the original cost. The conclusion is pretty straightforward. In the short run and in the long run, solar plus securitization is the least cost approach.
Still a bit murky? Let's think about securitization in another way. Securitization is similar to when a homeowner refinances a mortgage. Let's take a look at a quick example. You own a home with a mortgage and you're making payments to your lender. Interest rates go down, so you decide to refinance your mortgage with a new lender. The lower interest rate reduces your monthly payment, saving you money.
The mortgage example is very similar to how utility stranded assets can be paid off. Suppose utility customers are paying for the stranded assets related to closed coal plants. The customer's payments include a rate of return to the utility on the remaining balance. But what if the customers can find investors who would pay off the utility's investment? The customers would then begin to pay the investors with interest over time, but because these are securitized assets and the customer's payments are pledged to retiring those assets, the interest rate can be lower than the utility's cost of capital, saving customers money. What just happened? Well, investors buy customer-backed bonds. The proceeds are used to pay off the utility's approved portion of those assets. Customers stop paying the utility for these assets and begin to pay investors, retiring those bonds over time. Because the interest rate on bonds at about 3% is lower than the utility's rate of return, customers save money and their bills go down.
Ratepayer-backed bonds are created by state legislation that guarantees the bonds will be repaid. The bills, like Senate Bill 559 passed last October, include technical financial language so the bonds will be considered low risk by the bond rating agencies, earn a AAA rating, and achieve the lowest possible interest rate. The legislation must also define allowable uses for the bonds. North Carolina's statute allows the storm cost recovery use, but not other uses like the early retirement of uneconomic plants. The North Carolina Utilities Commission has an important role in approving the financing order and protecting ratepayer interests. Ideally, the North Carolina Utilities Commission will determine the amount of capital the utility can recover and supervise the bond issuance. The Commission can be an advocate to make certain the bonds are issued at the lowest interest rate and with the least amount of expense for ratepayers. Saving ratepayers money when uneconomic plants retire early is the reason securitization has been gaining new attention nationally. The trend started in 2017 and has been spreading across the country. Colorado, New Mexico, Montana passed bills in 2019 allowing bond use for plant retirements. North Carolina passed securitization legislation in 2019, but only for storm cost recovery. Wisconsin and Texas are considering amending existing securitization statutes to add plant retirements and transition assistance to the list of uses. North Carolina's new securitization statute allows ratepayer-backed bonds to be used for storm cost recovery, but missed the opportunity to make the bonds available when an uneconomic plant is retired early. The statute also does not permit bonds to be used to assist workers in communities facing transition issues when a power plant closes. Expanding the statute to allow these uses would provide extra savings for ratepayers and support North Carolina workers and communities. Another useful improvement to the statute would be to strengthen the North Carolina Utility Commission's bond oversight role to ensure ratepayers achieve maximum savings when the bonds are used. If you have any questions about securitization, you're welcome to contact either of us directly. Thank you.